Grace woke up every day before the sun even had a chance to warm the horizon over Chicago. The city's noise, cars already passing through the streets and the distant murmur of sirens, was a sound she had long since learned to ignore. The small kitchen in the apartment she shared with her son Ethan was simple but functional. The faded tiles and worn wooden shelves housed the essential ingredients for her survival: flour, sugar, and butter. Soon the smell of fresh pastries filled the space, a scent that for many would signify celebration, but for Grace was the essence of her livelihood. She carefully prepared each pastry that she would sell throughout the day. Her hands, calloused from years of work, moved with precision as she transformed simple ingredients into something that would bring a bit of financial relief to the family. Even in adversity, there was a gleam of pride in Grace's eyes. Doing this for Ethan filled her with a quiet strength, a determination known only to mothers. Ethan, on the other hand, was the opposite of his mother in terms of physical fragility. Tall for his age, with a lean face and ever-alert eyes, he had inherited Grace's resilience, but his battle was different. A student at one of Chicago's most prestigious schools, he felt like a fish out of water, surrounded by the children of influential businessmen and politicians. While his classmates arrived in imported cars, dressed in the finest clothes, Ethan held his head high, even wearing the old coat his mother had mended countless times. He knew his only wealth was his mind. Their routine intertwined like a well-practiced dance. Grace spent her days on the busy streets of Chicago, manning her pastry stand, braving the heat and cold, rain and wind, always with a smile for her customers, even when fatigue and back pain threatened to break her. For her, each sale was another step toward ensuring Ethan could keep studying, so he could have a better life than hers. Ethan, for his part, left early for school. The journey was long, and he always passed through the commercial district where he would catch a glimpse of his mother fighting to sell her pastries amidst the crowd. It filled him with a mixture of pride and pain. He knew everything she did was for him, but seeing his mother in that situation hurt deeply. It was that pain that fueled his motivation. He studied harder, dedicated himself more than most. He knew knowledge was his only weapon to change their reality. The relationship between Grace and Ethan was more than just a mother-son bond. It was a life partnership, a mutual understanding built on sacrifices and overcoming obstacles. At night, after long days, they would gather in the small living room where they shared the little they had. Ethan would talk about school, about the subjects he was learning, while Grace listened attentively, trying to hide her exhaustion and the worries about the bills piling up in the drawer. No matter how hard the day had been, there was always a smile, a word of encouragement. The apartment they lived in was small and noisy. Located in an old building on the south side of Chicago, the infrastructure left much to be desired. The thin walls let in the sounds of the neighborhood, and the constant creaking of the stairs was an annoyance. But none of this was reason for complaint. Grace and Ethan knew that, as simple as it was, that place represented the security they needed. It was a home built with love and sacrifice. Ethan understood that his reality was completely different from that of his classmates. He didn't have the latest electronic devices, the expensive gadgets, or brand-name clothes. His classmates, children from wealthy families, were always surrounded by luxury, while Ethan returned home on crowded buses and studied on an old tablet that sometimes wouldn't even turn on. But no matter how stark the differences, Ethan never complained. He knew that his efforts in school were the key to a better future, a way out of their situation. At school, despite his intelligence and dedication, Ethan was often the target of condescending looks and mean-spirited comments. Some students, like Brandon and Tyler, saw him as fragile, easily humiliated. Brandon, with his perfectly groomed blonde hair and always impeccably fitted clothes, was the typical rich kid from an influential family. Tyler, his sidekick in bullying, was a reflection of Brandon. Both knew they held power. Ethan's introversion and avoidance of confrontations only made them more comfortable in their taunting. Yet Ethan never reacted to the provocations. He knew he had to stay focused on his studies. Every challenge, every insult, was turned into fuel to make him better, so that one day his mother could be proud of him, not just for who he was, but for what he would achieve. This was the essence of Grace and Ethan's life. Hard days faced with dignity, in a city full of contrasts. Chicago, with its skyscrapers and busy avenues, was also the home of small dreams, of daily battles that went unnoticed by most. And in that modest apartment, Grace and Ethan fought their own quiet battle, believing that one day life would smile back at them. It was a morning like any other, or so it seemed. The sky over Chicago, covered in gray clouds, set the somber tone for the day ahead. Grace was already out with her pastry stand, her worn apron hanging around her neck and a welcoming smile on her face, despite the icy wind cutting through the city. The streets were busier than usual. People hurried by, and she, as always, offered her pastries with hope. Ethan had also left early for school, but this time something felt different. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the growing restlessness he felt as graduation drew near. The big day he and his mother had worked so hard for. As he passed the corner where his mother set up her small stand, he spotted her from a distance. He watched her for a brief moment, as he always did, admiring her resilience. To Ethan, Grace was more than a mother. She was the rock that held his life together, the embodiment of sacrifice and strength. At school, as he prepared for another day of classes, Ethan could sense that the taunting from Brandon and Tyler was about to escalate. Lately, the tension with them had been building. They saw him as an easy target, a poor kid in the middle of the elite, without the resources or status that everyone else had. Those two represented everything Ethan despised: arrogance, disrespect, and a lack of empathy. Until now, he had managed to endure the daily humiliations, like the shoves in the hallway, the whispers, and the stifled laughter as he passed. But that day, things would be different. During recess, Brandon and Tyler, always accompanied by a group of friends, began to surround him. Ethan was sitting with his nose buried in a science book when he heard Brandon's voice echo. "Look who's here, the poor nerd," said Brandon, with a cynical smile on his face, as the others laughed. Ethan, maintaining his usual self-control, glanced up briefly before refocusing on his book. He knew it wouldn't help to retaliate. They wanted a reaction, and he refused to give them the satisfaction. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Tyler added, lightly kicking Ethan's chair. Inside, Ethan felt his anger growing. Every day, this kind of provocation became harder to ignore. He knew he had to keep calm, but the contempt he felt for those boys gnawed at him. "Could you guys just leave me alone? I've got more important things to do," Ethan said, without lifting his head from the book, trying to sound indifferent. Brandon laughed loudly, attracting more attention from the other students nearby. "Look at that. The poor kid thinks he can talk to us like that. Just because you got that pathetic scholarship, you think you're better than us?" Brandon mocked, pushing Ethan's books off the table. The books fell to the floor with a dull thud, scattering papers and notebooks. Ethan felt his blood rush to his head. His breathing became heavy, but he bent down to pick up his things, trying to stay calm. He was used to this kind of thing, but that day, something inside him started to crack. What he didn't know was that this incident, which seemed like just another common provocation, was about to trigger something much bigger. That same afternoon, as Grace was finishing her sales and starting to pack up her stand, two familiar faces appeared in the distance: Brandon and Tyler. They, who had never shown any interest in Grace's pastries, were approaching this time with malicious smiles on their faces. Grace, always polite and patient, didn't immediately recognize them. With the same kindness she offered every customer, she greeted them. "Can I help you, boys? Would you like to try one of my pastries?" Tyler and Brandon exchanged a look of scorn. For them, it was unthinkable that someone like Grace would even dare to offer them anything. She didn't know who they were, but they knew exactly who she was: the mother of the poor kid who went to their school. "Oh, we were just wondering if you had any discounts for people like us," Tyler said mockingly. Brandon, stepping closer, looked directly into Grace's eyes. "I heard your son is one of the scholarship students at our school. Must be tough, huh? He must be so proud of you, selling candy on the street to support him," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Grace, sensing the cruel tone, tried to keep calm. "My son works hard for his studies. He's going to go far," she replied, with all the dignity she had left, even though she felt a lump forming in her throat. Brandon laughed, clearly enjoying the situation. "Well, let's hope he goes really far, because he doesn't belong in our world," he added, while Tyler, without warning, kicked a small puddle of mud in Grace's direction, splattering her dress and her candy. The mud spread quickly, staining the simple dress she had bought with so much effort for a special day that was soon approaching: Ethan's graduation. That was too much. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt her legs tremble. Tears threatened to come, but she held them back. The humiliation burned inside her, but she wouldn't let them see it. Brandon and Tyler laughed, satisfied with the damage they had done. Without another word, they turned their backs and walked away, leaving Grace standing there in the middle of the street, covered in mud and heartbroken. She had faced so many hardships in life, but this pain was different. It was personal. It was the pain of seeing years of sacrifice, the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, thrown to the ground like mud. When she finally managed to move, Grace gathered her things and went home. Still dirty, her dignity shattered, she knew she couldn't let this define her. But one thing was clear. A lifetime of sacrifice was being tested, and the cost of the humiliation was becoming too much to bear. At the end of the day, Ethan came home exhausted. The teasing at school was already tough on its own, but lately, something inside him was changing. He felt he was nearing a breaking point, where the bullying and contempt he received from his classmates, especially from Brandon and Tyler, were testing the limits of his patience and self-control. When he opened the door to their small apartment, he found his mother sitting in the old armchair she always occupied at the end of each day, staring out the window. Something was wrong. She hadn't changed, and her dress was visibly dirty, stained with mud. Grace's gaze was distant, and even though she tried to hide it, Ethan could see the pain in her eyes. He knew his mother well enough to realize that when she allowed herself to sit in silence, it was because something serious had happened. "Mom," he called softly, approaching her. Grace slowly turned her head to look at him. There was no anger in her eyes, but a deep exhaustion. The kind of emotional fatigue that came from years of struggle, from trying to maintain dignity in the storms of life. Without saying anything, she forced a smile, trying to reassure him, but Ethan knew that smile was far from sincere. "It's okay, Ethan. I just had a tough day," she said, her voice weaker than usual. Ethan frowned, worried. He knelt beside the armchair, holding his mother's hands. That's when he noticed the mud stains and the sorry state of the dress she was wearing. The same dress she had bought so carefully, saving every penny she could to wear it on his big graduation day. "What happened, Mom?" he asked, more urgently. "Who did this to you?" Grace sighed deeply. She knew there was no point in hiding the truth, but she feared Ethan's reaction. Her son, who had always been so focused and determined, had managed to stay calm despite the bullying he faced at school. However, she sensed that this time might be different. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before. A fire of indignation, a restrained anger that was about to explode. "It was those two boys from your school," she admitted, lowering her eyes. "Brandon and Tyler. They humiliated me today, Ethan. They threw mud at me, laughed in my face. They knew I was your mother, and they said you don't belong in their world." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan felt the blood boiling in his veins. The anger he had held back for so long started to overflow. Every taunt he had endured, every insult, every look of disdain, it all seemed to culminate in that moment. But now, it wasn't just about him. They had targeted the most important person in his life, the one person he had sworn to protect and honor. "I'm not going to let this go, Mom," Ethan said firmly, standing up abruptly. "They can't do this to you. With me, fine. But with you? No, this has gone too far." Grace slowly stood up, wiping away the tears that had started to run down her face. She knew Ethan's temper, and she knew he was hurt, just as much as she was. But the fear of losing control in the face of injustice was something she deeply feared. She grabbed his arm firmly, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Ethan, you're better than this. I know you're angry and so am I, but we need to think clearly. We can't stoop to their level. Everything I've done in my life has been to ensure you have a future, so you could be someone with pride, integrity, and character. We're not going to let these boys destroy that." Grace's voice was firm, but her eyes pleaded for him not to follow the path of blind revenge. She knew that if Ethan confronted Brandon and Tyler impulsively, it could damage not only his reputation, but also his future. The dilemma unfolding before Ethan was immense. He could fight for his mother's honor and directly confront those responsible, or he could follow Grace's advice and try to keep control, despite the humiliation and pain they were both feeling. But how can someone just accept such humiliation and move on? The image of his mother, covered in mud and struggling to maintain her dignity, was something he couldn't bear. Every time he thought of Brandon and Tyler, the rage inside him grew. He felt that for the first time he couldn't ignore the situation. After all, they had crossed a line. "I can't let this go, Mom. Not this time," Ethan said, feeling the weight of his words. "They humiliated you. This isn't just about me. You don't deserve that." Grace took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stop Ethan from feeling what he felt, but she also knew she had to guide him to act wisely. She didn't want her son's future tainted by a decision made in the heat of the moment. "I understand, Ethan. I understand your pain," Grace said, her voice soft but firm. "But we need to think with our heads, not our hearts. You're smart. You're strong, and you can handle this the right way." Ethan pondered his mother's words, feeling torn. The part of him that always tried to be rational and balanced was in conflict with the part that wanted immediate justice. He knew that if he went after Brandon and Tyler now, things could spiral out of control. But his mind began to form a different plan, one that might bring justice in a way his mother would approve of. He remembered that graduation was approaching, and as class valedictorian, he would have a platform in front of all his classmates, teachers, and parents. Brandon and Tyler would be there, and he'd have a unique opportunity to expose the truth. Maybe at that moment, when he was supposed to celebrate his achievements, he could tell the real story about his mom. Grace's sacrifice didn't deserve to be silenced. It was time to reveal everything that had been hidden in the shadows of routine and daily struggle. "I'm going to handle this, Mom, but in my own way," Ethan decided, feeling a new strength grow inside him. The days leading up to graduation were long for Ethan. The weight of what he had decided still hung over his mind. He kept his plan secret, even from his mother, Grace. Every day, she asked if he was ready for his speech, if he needed help, but Ethan always responded with a calm smile, not revealing his true intentions. The big day finally arrived. Chicago woke up to a cloudy sky, but for Grace, the brightness of that moment couldn't be dimmed. She had fought so hard to see her son there among the best, and was determined to be part of it, no matter what had happened days before. The white dress, still faintly stained from the humiliation she had suffered, was her choice. It was a reminder of her struggle and the triumph that came with time. Ethan watched his mother in silence as she got ready. He saw her adjusting the dress, carefully fixing her hair, and he felt a mix of admiration and pain. He knew this was the day to honor her, to show the world the true value of the woman who had given everything for him. But he also knew that Grace, so humble and discreet, would never expect him to bring up what he was about to reveal. "Are you ready, son?" she asked with her usual warm smile. "I am, Mom," he replied, hiding the nervousness growing in his chest. When they arrived at the school, the atmosphere was festive. Proud families filled the auditorium. The pomp and luxury of the event were evident. Parents hugged their children, snapped photos, and exchanged words of affection. Grace, even with the simplicity of her dress, walked with her head held high. She was proud to be there for Ethan, and nothing in the world could take that away from her. As the first students took the stage, Grace felt emotional. The glow in the eyes of other mothers reflected what she felt inside. However, a shadow formed in her heart when she spotted Brandon and Tyler sitting at the front of the auditorium with their families. They seemed carefree, oblivious to the harm they had caused. To them, that humiliation was an insignificant episode. Grace felt a pang in her chest, but she held herself together. It was Ethan's day, and she didn't want anything to ruin it. When Ethan's name was announced as the valedictorian, Grace straightened in her seat. She had always known her son was special, but seeing him recognized in such a grand way filled her with pride. However, something in her heart told her this speech would be different. Ethan had been more introspective in recent days, and though he said he was ready, Grace didn't know exactly what to expect. Ethan walked onto the stage with steady steps, though his heart raced. From up there, he could see his mother sitting in the last row. The white dress stained with mud was a constant reminder of what he was about to do. He adjusted the microphone, glanced at the pages of the speech he had prepared for weeks, and then, with a deep sigh, decided not to follow that script. There, in front of everyone, he knew he had to speak the truth. Grace, unaware of what was about to happen, looked at him with a soft smile, proud. Ethan looked back at her, and at that moment, he knew the speech wasn't just for his classmates, teachers, or parents. It was for her. Everything he had endured, all the taunts and humiliation, had been for her, and now, it was time to repay. "Good afternoon, everyone," Ethan began, his voice firm but with a slight tremor in his hands. "Today is a very special day for all of us. This is the moment when we celebrate achievements, victories, and the end of a journey." Grace heard the first words with her heart racing, but she quickly realized there was something different in her son's tone. Ethan had always been discreet and careful, but the intensity in his voice suggested he was about to do something unexpected. She couldn't take her eyes off him. "When I came to this school, I knew it would be a challenge. I knew that coming from where I come from, it wouldn't be easy to fit in. I come from a very different reality than most of you," Ethan continued, looking at his classmates. "While many of you have everything you need, I had to fight for every achievement." The tension in the air was palpable. Grace began to feel a knot in her chest. She was no longer smiling as something told her that Ethan was about to reveal something much bigger. "But I didn't get here alone. I had someone by my side, someone who made unimaginable sacrifices so I could be here. My mom, Grace, is sitting in the back," he said, pointing to where she sat. All eyes turned to Grace, who was now completely surprised. She felt her face flush, unsure of how to react to this unexpected moment. She never thought she would be mentioned by Ethan that day, much less in a public speech. My mom, Ethan continued, his voice breaking, works every day on the streets of Chicago selling candy. She wakes up before the sun rises and faces the cold, the rain, the heat, all to make sure I have a chance to build a better future. Everything I am, I owe to her. Grace, now with tears in her eyes, looked intently at her son. She had never imagined he would do this, that he would reveal their struggles and sacrifices so openly. She was overwhelmed with emotion, feeling her heart swell with both pride and pain. But Ethan wasn't done yet. But not everyone here respects that. Not everyone here understands what it's like to live like that. Some people prefer to humiliate, prefer to attack those who don't have the same privileges. And today, I need to talk about something that happened. Brandon and Tyler. He looked directly at the two, his eyes serious and unwavering. You humiliated my mom. You threw mud at her, laughed at her, and you did it thinking that money and power gave you the right to do so. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Brandon and Tyler, sitting in the front row, seemed frozen, unable to process what was happening. The discomfort was visible on their faces as their families looked around, trying to absorb the gravity of the public accusation. You may have everything money can buy, but you have no idea what dignity, respect, and sacrifice are. My mom has more strength in her calloused hands than you'll ever have in your entire lives. Ethan paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. Grace, still stunned, couldn't hold back the tears. All of this was a surprise, but at the same time, it was the truth she carried within her, and hearing her son defend her in this way filled her with an indescribable emotion. What you did was wrong, Ethan concluded, his eyes locked on Brandon and Tyler. But today isn't about you. Today is about my mom. She is the real reason I'm here, and this diploma, this moment, belongs to her as much as it does to me. The auditorium remained silent for a few seconds, until one person began to clap. Soon the applause filled the room, growing in intensity. Grace, now standing, was crying and smiling at the same time, incredulous at what had just happened. Brandon and Tyler were embarrassed, their families speechless. Ethan came down from the stage and went straight to his mother. They embraced, and in that moment, Grace knew that all the sacrifice, all the pain and humiliation she had endured, had been worth it. After Ethan's speech, the auditorium was a mix of shock and emotion. His words had resonated deeply with everyone present, but the tension hung in the air. For many, it was the first time they had seen beyond appearances, beyond the superficial shine that surrounded the school and its privileged students. Grace's sacrifice, a simple woman who fought every day for her son's chance, had been laid bare, raw, and honest. And for Ethan, that moment marked the end of the silence he had kept for years. However, not everyone reacted the same way. While most of the people in the auditorium clapped, visibly moved, the families of Brandon and Tyler were completely uncomfortable. Brandon and Tyler, once so arrogant, now seemed to shrink into their seats. Their faces were flushed with embarrassment, unable to maintain the air of superiority they always flaunted. Their parents, sitting beside them, looked shocked, exchanging tense glances. What was supposed to be a day of celebration had turned into a moment of public exposure that they were not prepared to face. Ethan, now standing next to his mother, felt a wave of relief mixed with nervousness. As much as he knew his words had been necessary, he couldn't predict what would happen next. Grace, still shaken by the surprise of the speech, looked at her son with a mix of pride and concern. I didn't know you were going to do that, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling as she wiped away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. I had to, Mom, he replied, holding her hand. I couldn't stay silent any longer. What you went through, what we went through, they needed to know. Grace smiled, though she was still visibly nervous. She knew her son had a good heart, but she feared the repercussions of that courageous act. What would their lives be like after this? How would Brandon and Tyler react? And their families, so influential and powerful. The fear that something bad might happen began to take over her mind. As the event continued, Brandon and Tyler's families, clearly uncomfortable, stood up from their seats before the ceremony ended. Their departure didn't go unnoticed, but most people chose to ignore it. Brandon, in particular, shot a mix of anger and shame toward Ethan as he left the auditorium. This wasn't over, and Ethan knew it. The next day, news of Ethan's speech spread like wildfire across the school's social media. Short videos recorded on students' phones circulated quickly, and Grace's story and her humiliation began to gain attention. Many students who had previously ignored Ethan now saw him in a new light, admiring his courage for standing up to the school's elites. However, it also brought unexpected consequences. Brandon and Tyler, who had always been untouchable in the school environment, now faced a wave of judgment they had never experienced before. Their families, who held influence and prestige, were not at all pleased with the negative attention they were receiving. Brandon's parents, in particular, were well-known figures in Chicago's business world and were determined to protect the family's reputation at any cost. A week after the event, Ethan Matthews, a man with a severe appearance and restrained manner, waited for him with a serious expression. As Ethan walked in, he felt the weight of the moment. He knew this was about his speech, but he didn't imagine how much things had escalated. "Ethan, thank you for coming so quickly," the principal began, gesturing for him to sit. "I want to talk to you about what happened at the graduation." Ethan nodded, remaining calm. He didn't regret his words, but he was ready to face whatever consequences came. "Your speech had a big impact," the principal continued, folding his hands on the desk. "And I must say it was extremely brave of you to bring up such a personal and delicate issue. But," he paused, adjusting his glasses. "Some people were not happy with what was said." Ethan remained silent, waiting for what would come next. He knew that the school, as an institution, was deeply connected to the influential families of students like Brandon and Tyler, and he expected some form of negative response. "Brandon and Tyler's parents have filed a formal complaint against you," the principal said with a tone of concern. "They claim that your words were defamatory and that you've damaged their families' reputations." Ethan felt his heart race. It wasn't surprising that these families would try to protect themselves, but the idea that he could be accused of defamation was absurd. All he had done was tell the truth. "That's not fair," he replied firmly. "I just spoke about what happened. They humiliated my mother, and everyone saw what they did." The principal sighed, clearly in an uncomfortable position. "I know, Ethan. I saw what happened, and I know you were telling the truth. But these families, well, they have a lot of power, and the school is under pressure. Brandon and Tyler's parents are demanding a public retraction from you, or they'll take it further, even legally." Ethan felt a surge of indignation rise inside him. A public retraction? Apologize for defending his mother? That seemed unthinkable. "I won't retract," he said firmly. "I'm not going to apologize for something they did." The principal nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. Ethan was one of the school's top students, known for his ethics and determination, but it was clear this situation was a minefield. "I understand your position, Ethan," the principal said, "but you need to understand the gravity of the situation. If this continues, there could be serious consequences, including for your scholarship. It's not something I want, but the pressure is coming from above." The mention of his scholarship made Ethan's stomach turn. He knew how much his education meant to his mother, how much she had sacrificed to give him this opportunity. And now everything was at risk because of the truth he had decided to speak. "I'll talk to my mom," Ethan said, controlling his anger. "But I won't apologize for something I didn't do wrong." The principal nodded again, clearly worried about where this was headed. "I know you're in a difficult position, Ethan, and whatever happens, know that I respect your courage. But be prepared for what's to come." Ethan left the office with his head full of thoughts. He knew he had done the right thing, but now he was facing a tough choice. The threat of losing his scholarship and his education, something he and his mother had fought so hard for, hung over him. On the other hand, if he apologized, he would be denying everything he and Grace had endured. It would be like admitting that the humiliation his mother suffered didn't matter, that her dignity could be ignored. When he got home, he found Grace sitting at the table, wearing her usual look of exhaustion. She looked at him and, without asking, knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked calmly. Ethan sighed, sitting down beside her. "Brandon and Tyler's parents want me to publicly retract, or they'll take it to court." Silence filled the room. Grace stayed quiet for a long moment, and Ethan knew she was processing the information. She knew what was at stake. "And what are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes full of the calm only a mother could have. Ethan knew the answer wasn't easy. The dilemma was bigger than he had imagined. But at that moment, he was determined to stand up for what he believed in. "I'm not going to apologize, Mom. I'm not backing down from what I said. They can't silence us." Grace smiled softly. "You're so strong, Ethan," she murmured, feeling a mix of pride and fear. "But we need to think carefully. We'll face this together, like we always have." The days following Ethan's meeting with the principal were filled with constant tension. Grace and Ethan had long discussions about what to do. As much as she respected her son's courage, Grace feared the consequences. Ethan was determined to stand his ground, but the weight of the threats grew heavier every day. Meanwhile, social media buzzed. The video of Ethan's speech continued to circulate, attracting even more attention. The impact wasn't limited to the school. Slowly, local newspapers began to mention the case, turning it into a topic of public debate. Ethan's words not only denounced the humiliation he and his mother had suffered, but also opened up a conversation about the inequalities within elite SC. The contrast between students from simple families and those raised in privilege and comfort became the center of discussions. Brandon and Tyler, who once felt untouchable, now faced unexpected pressure. Public judgment was relentless. Even those who had previously stayed silent about their behavior were now openly criticizing them. Their families, however, were more determined than ever to stifle the situation. Brandon's father, a powerful businessman with political connections, took legal action. He couldn't accept that his son had been exposed so publicly, and his wounded pride drove him to attack with all the force his status allowed. A formal letter of summons arrived at Grace and Ethan's apartment on a gray afternoon. When the postman handed her the envelope, a shiver ran down Grace's spine. She slowly opened it and read the contents. It was official. Brandon and Tyler's families were suing Ethan for defamation and emotional distress. "This is really happening, Mom," Ethan said, staring blankly at the paper, feeling the weight of the looming threat. For a moment, Grace was silent. She knew her son was now facing one of the toughest decisions of his life. Ethan had the choice to back down, give in to the pressure and issue a retraction, or stand his ground and fight, knowing that significant losses were at stake, including the scholarship that was so crucial to his future. "We can't afford to deal with a lawsuit like this," Grace said softly, fear evident in her voice. "They have powerful lawyers. They could destroy us." Ethan looked at her, and for a brief moment, he felt the same insecurity. His future was hanging by a thread, and he knew how much his education meant to Grace. She had sacrificed everything so that he could attend that school, and now, because of one act of bravery, it all seemed on the verge of collapse. But in that moment of uncertainty, an unexpected twist occurred. The next day, while Grace was working at her candy stall, something unusual happened. A well-dressed woman approached her. Grace, accustomed to dealing with all kinds of people, offered her some sweets, but the woman seemed interested in something else. "You're Grace, Ethan's mother, right?" the woman asked with a gentle smile. Grace, a bit surprised, nodded in confirmation. "I'm Julia Roberts," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm an attorney, and also the mother of one of your son's classmates. I was deeply moved by what happened at the graduation ceremony. Ethan's speech was brave, and I know you're facing a difficult situation right now." Grace, unsure how to respond, thanked her, though she was visibly confused. Julia seemed like a successful woman, someone familiar with the world of courtrooms, not the type to get involved in the affairs of more modest families like hers. "I've read about the lawsuit," Julia continued, "and I want to help. I won't charge anything. But I believe we can fight this injustice. We can't let powerful families use their resources to silence people like you and your son." Grace was stunned. It was hard to believe that someone she didn't know was offering to help them in such a delicate situation. Relief, mixed with disbelief, filled her eyes with tears. "But why?" Grace asked, unable to hold back her emotion. "Why would you do this for us?" Julia smiled with understanding. "I come from a humble family too. My mother, like you, did everything so I could study. When I saw Ethan's video, something in me was deeply touched. I felt that if no one does anything, this will happen to others. We can't allow that. Besides, I believe in justice, and this is an opportunity to fight for it." Grace was silent for a few seconds, feeling a wave of hope swell in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt that maybe there was a way out. Maybe they could fight, with someone experienced by their side. "We accept your help," Grace said, gripping Julia's hands tightly. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to, Grace. We'll do this together. We'll fight for Ethan, for you, and for all the people facing this kind of situation." Julia began preparing the defense, carefully studying the case and gathering necessary evidence. Videos of Ethan's speech, which had now gone viral, became key pieces in the case. They clearly showed that Ethan hadn't defamed Brandon or Tyler, but rather told the truth about the humiliation his mother had endured. Furthermore, several students at the school started speaking out in support of Ethan, recounting other incidents of Brandon and Tyler's abusive behavior and bullying. However, Brandon and Tyler's families were not willing to back down. They intended to use all their influence to win the case and crush any opposition. For them, it wasn't just about justice, but about protecting their family's name and the status they had built over the years. Ethan, meanwhile, felt torn. Though he had the support of Julia and other classmates, the pressure to give up was mounting. He knew the consequences of losing the case would be devastating. His scholarship, his chance to attend a good university, and even his mother's livelihood were on the line. But at the same time, he knew that backing down would feel like betraying everything he and his mother had fought for. With Julia's help, Ethan's defense grew stronger each day, but there was still uncertainty. How would things unfold in court? The power of Brandon and Tyler's families seemed unbeatable, yet now Grace and Ethan had an ally, someone ready to fight alongside them. The unexpected turn of events with Julia's arrival brought new hope to Grace and Ethan, but the road ahead would be challenging, and they would need all their courage to face the greatest trial of their lives. The day of the trial arrived, and the weight of anxiety hung in the air. Grace and Ethan, accompanied by Julia, entered the Chicago courthouse with their hearts racing. The lawsuit filed by Brandon and Tyler's families had now become the center of attention. The courtroom was packed. Many curious onlookers, classmates, and even some journalists gathered to follow the case, which had quickly become a symbol of the fight against inequality and abuse of power. On the other side of the room stood Brandon, Tyler, and their parents, conversing with their stern-faced lawyer. The families, accustomed to wielding power and influence, were confident that the trial would be an easy victory. They had the money and the right connections. To them, Ethan and Grace were nothing more than a temporary nuisance, something the system would resolve in their favor, as it had so many times before. Ethan, sitting next to his mother, felt his stomach twist. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about the consequences of this trial. Losing meant ruining his chances of attending a good university, losing his scholarship, and plunging his mother into debt from which they might never recover. But on the other hand, giving in and apologizing would mean denying everything he believed in, everything Grace had sacrificed for. Julia, sitting next to them, mentally prepared for the legal battle ahead. Though confident in her strategy, she knew they were up against powerful adversaries. The pressure was everywhere, but she knew the truth was on their side, and that gave her strength. When the judge entered the room, everyone rose. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The initial formalities were brief, and soon the trial began. Brandon and Tyler's lawyers were the first to speak. They laid out their claims that Ethan had publicly defamed the two boys, exposing them in a humiliating way in front of their classmates and families. To them, Ethan's speech at graduation was more than a personal expression. It was a direct attack on the family's reputations. Brandon's lawyer argued with a cold, calculated tone. "What we have here is a clear case of defamation. My client, Brandon Harris, was the target of baseless and exaggerated accusations. Ethan's speech was not just a personal account, but an attack that caused irreparable harm to Brandon and his family's reputation. The school, a place of learning and respect, became the stage for a public defamation that humiliated my client beyond repair," he continued, detailing how Brandon and his family had been victims of malicious comments on social media and in school gossip circles. The lawyer skillfully painted Brandon as the true victim, claiming that Ethan had distorted the facts to gain sympathy. As Ethan listened, a knot formed in his throat. The way they were twisting the situation, turning the bullies into victims, was infuriating. He looked over at Julia, seeking reassurance. She returned his gaze with a firm look, silently assuring him that they were still in control. When the lawyer finished his argument, the judge turned to Julia. She stood up with a resolute posture, walking to the center of the room, her gaze determined. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what we have here is not a case of defamation," Julia began, her strong voice echoing through the room. "What we have is a desperate attempt by powerful families to use the legal system to silence an inconvenient truth. Ethan Williams, in making his speech at graduation, was not fabricating a story. He was telling a fact. His mother was humiliated by Brandon Harris and Tyler Clark, and this was witnessed by several people." Julia then called several witnesses to the stand, people who had been present the day Grace was attacked. Witness after witness described how Brandon and Tyler had acted, throwing mud at Grace and laughing at her condition. With each testimony, the truth became more evident. Brandon and Tyler were not victims, but the perpetrators of cruel and humiliating behavior. "What we are seeing here," Julia continued, "is a classic example of abuse of power. Wealthy, influential families who think they can do whatever they want without ever facing the consequences of their actions. Ethan is not on trial because he lied. He's on trial because he dared to tell the truth, and that makes people uncomfortable." Julia's defense was direct, clear, and compelling. She presented videos and testimonies that confirmed the truthfulness of Ethan's words. She also demonstrated how Brandon and Tyler's actions not only harmed Grace's dignity, but revealed a pattern of abusive and humiliating behavior that they had maintained for years at the school. Brandon and Tyler were called to testify, but their answers were evasive. Their lawyers advised them to downplay the events, framing them as a prank that got out of hand. However, the pressure in the courtroom was mounting. The judge and jury clearly saw that this was not a mere prank, but a clear case of bullying and humiliation. Ethan was the last to testify. As he stood, Grace's heart raced. She knew how much her son had suffered, how much he had endured in silence. Now he had the chance to defend not only himself, but also her. "I didn't want to hurt Brandon or Tyler," Ethan began, looking directly at the jury. "But they caused a lot of pain to my mom and me. I've always kept quiet at school, always tried to focus on my studies. But when I saw what they did to my mom, throwing mud at her, laughing at her, I couldn't stay silent anymore. My mom always taught me to be strong, to fight for what's right, and I did what had to be done. I told the truth." Ethan's eyes shone with emotion as he spoke about his mother's sacrifices, the hardships they faced, and how deeply the humiliation had hurt him. His words resonated throughout the courtroom. The jury was visibly moved by the young man's sincerity, and even the judge seemed to reflect on the seriousness of the situation. When Ethan finished his testimony, the room was utterly silent. The judge then announced that the trial would be suspended for the jury's final deliberation. Ethan returned to his seat beside Grace, who embraced him tightly. "You were amazing, Ethan," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No matter what happens now, I'm so proud of you." Ethan hugged her back, feeling that regardless of the outcome, he had done the right thing. The battle was coming to an end, but he knew they weren't alone. They had fought for justice, and that was all that mattered. The courtroom was steeped in intense silence as everyone awaited the verdict. The jury's deliberation hours seemed endless to Ethan and Grace. Julia, sitting beside them, remained calm, but even she knew the outcome was uncertain. Facing powerful and influential families like Brandon and Tyler's was never easy, and the trial had exposed everyone's vulnerabilities. On the other side of the room, Brandon and Tyler, accompanied by their parents, whispered with their lawyers. Their confidence seemed, for those who had always lived in privilege, the idea that the system might not favor their families was inconceivable. Brandon's father especially appeared impatient. He believed that his money and influence would be enough to end the case quickly. But now the jury had returned, and all awaited the sentence. The judge, a man of stern and impartial demeanor, took his place at the center of the courtroom. The murmurs ceased, and the room fell into total silence. All eyes were on the jury's forewoman, a woman with a neutral expression, holding the verdict in her hands. Ethan felt his heart race, and beside him, Grace squeezed his hand tightly, sharing the tense moment. In the case of defamation brought by the families of Brandon Harris and Tyler Clark against Ethan Williams, the forewoman began, her voice clear and firm. The jury finds the defendant, Ethan Williams, not guilty. The evidence presented proves that the events described are true, and that Ethan's speech was a legitimate exposure of facts, with no intent to defame. The room was silent for a moment before whispers and murmurs began to circulate. Relief washed over Ethan. He felt the enormous weight he had been carrying lift from his shoulders as his mother squeezed his hand harder, tears welling in her eyes. But the reading of the verdict wasn't over. Based on the evidence presented, the jury also finds that the plaintiffs, Brandon Harris and Tyler Clark, are guilty of harassment and public humiliation against Mrs. Grace Williams. In response, the court sentences both to 6 months in jail, in addition to compensating Mrs. Williams for moral damages. A shock ran through the courtroom. Brandon and Tyler, who had previously been visibly confident, now seemed stunned, unable to process what they had just heard. Their parents, who had never even considered the possibility of a criminal conviction, were in disbelief. The boys' lawyers immediately began whispering among themselves, clearly discussing a possible appeal, but the sentence had been handed down. Ethan and Grace, on the other hand, sat in silence. Grace looked at her son, still processing what had just happened. The 6 months in jail for Brandon and Tyler seemed like an unexpected outcome, but one that symbolized justice for the years of impunity and arrogance they had lived with. The judge, with a final strike of the gavel, formalized the sentence. This court believes that justice must be served, and acts of cruelty like those committed by Brandon Harris and Tyler Clark cannot be ignored. If we do not learn from our mistakes, we will continue to repeat harmful behaviors. Let this sentence serve as a reminder that no one is above the law. As the judge concluded the session, the room seemed divided between surprise and relief. Ethan, still processing everything, looked at his mother. She, always composed, was visibly emotional. He knew that this sentence meant more than just justice for them. It meant that finally, the people who had caused so much pain would face the consequences of their actions. As Brandon and Tyler's families left the courtroom, the boys, with grim expressions, were escorted by justice officers. They, who had always felt untouchable, now faced the harsh reality of their choices. There would be consequences for what they had done, and for the first time, they felt the weight of that. Ethan and Grace, on the other hand, left the courtroom with a sense of relief. There was justice, yes, but at the same time, there was space for something greater, forgiveness. Despite all the humiliation and pain, Grace was never one to hold grudges. She looked at Ethan and knew the worst was behind them. As they walked out of the courtroom, Julia approached them, smiling triumphantly. "You were incredible," she said, embracing Grace and Ethan. "Justice was served, and it was only possible because of your courage." "Thank you for everything, Julia," Grace said, her voice full of emotion. "We couldn't have done it without you." Julia smiled, but then something unexpected happened. Brandon and Tyler, now in custody, paused for a moment at the exit. Both looked at Ethan and Grace with mixed expressions of regret and fear. It seemed that, finally, the weight of their actions had hit them. Brandon, who had always been the most arrogant of the two, finally spoke. "I know I can't undo what we did," he said, his voice breaking. "But I'm sorry. We were wrong. I was wrong. What we did to your mom—" He stopped, struggling to find the words. "I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." Tyler, standing beside him, nodded silently in agreement. Grace, with surprising calm, stepped forward. She looked at the two boys, and for a moment, she pondered. The anger she had felt in the past seemed to dissolve in that instant, replaced by something greater. "We all make mistakes," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What matters is learning from them. If you truly are sorry, I hope you use this time to reflect and become better people. Life gives second chances, and you still have time to change." Brandon and Tyler nodded, appearing genuinely touched by Grace's words. Ethan watched in silence, still processing the situation. He knew that while the two deserved their punishment, his mother's forgiveness was a sign that they could move forward, free of resentment. As the officers led them away, Ethan and Grace finally felt they could breathe again. The fight was over, and now the path ahead was clear. Grace held her son's hand tightly and smiled. "Let's go home, Ethan. We can finally move on." Months passed since the verdict, and Grace and Ethan's lives began to adjust to a new rhythm. The court case had been widely discussed, not only in the schools of Chicago, but also in the local media. The story of a determined mother and a brave son who dared to stand up against the abuse of power from influential families moved many people. In the days following the trial, Grace and Ethan were approached by neighbors, strangers, and even some of Ethan's former schoolmates, who now recognized his courage and dignity. But more important than the external recognition was the sense of peace that little by little filled Grace's heart. For the first time in many years, she felt that her lifelong sacrifice had been fairly acknowledged. The compensation money helped with the apartment expenses, but for Grace, the true reward was seeing Ethan free from humiliation and ready to pursue his dreams. Despite the emotional toll of the trial, Grace held no grudges. She had forgiven Brandon and Tyler, hoping they would truly take the opportunity to learn and grow. After their sentencing, the two boys began serving their months in detention, and despite all their attempts to escape the consequences, they were being forced to reflect on their actions. They knew their privileged status hadn't been enough to shield them from justice, and that deeply changed their view of the world. But for Grace and Ethan, life was beginning to move forward in a much more positive way. Ethan, now with his scholarship secured, was about to start university, where his academic talents would continue to shine. The future that once seemed so uncertain was now a reality within reach. Grace's sacrifices had paid off, and Ethan was determined to make the most of this opportunity. On a sunny spring morning, Ethan was getting ready for his first day at university. The apartment, still modest, felt lighter, filled with hope. As he packed his backpack, his mother watched him from the kitchen doorway, pride evident on her face. "Are you ready?" Grace asked with a soft smile. Ethan turned to her, feeling a wave of emotion as he realized how much they had overcome together. He crossed the room and hugged his mother tightly. "I'm more than ready, Mom, and it's all thanks to you." Grace hugged him back, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. Watching her son grow, ready to face the world with the strength and dignity she had always hoped for, was the greatest reward she could ever receive. "I just did what any mother would do," she said, trying to downplay the sacrifice, though they both knew how immense it had been. "No, Mom, you did more. You never gave up, even when everything was against us." and I'll never forget that. Everything I achieve from here on out will be because you gave me this chance." Grace smiled, moved. She knew Ethan carried an unshakable strength within him, and that his future would be bright. That difficult phase of their lives was finally behind them, and now they could focus on building a new path. At university, Ethan quickly stood out. He had brought the same dedication and resilience to the academic environment that had helped him overcome so many struggles in school. Beyond his academic achievements, he found new friendships and opportunities that broadened his horizons. Without the shadows of bullying or humiliation, Ethan flourished, and his passion for learning guided him toward new challenges and accomplishments. Meanwhile, Grace continued with her life, but in a much more peaceful way. Although she was still selling sweets on the streets of Chicago, something within her had changed. She no longer carried the weight of shame or fear of the future. The way people saw her had also changed. She was no longer the candy seller who was ignored or humiliated, but rather a strong woman, respected by everyone who knew her story. With every smile she received from her customers and neighbors, Grace felt renewed, knowing that despite all the adversities, she had managed to create something lasting, the dignity of her life and the promising future of her son. One day, while arranging her small candy stand, Grace saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Julia, the lawyer who had helped them during the trial. They exchanged warm smiles, and Julia walked up to greet her. "How are things around here?" Julia asked as she grabbed one of the sweets Grace was offering. "Much better, thanks to you," Grace replied sincerely. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped us." Julia smiled but shook her head modestly. "You two already had everything you needed. I just gave a little push. The real credit goes to you and Ethan. It was your strength that made all the difference." Grace smiled, grateful. "Still, I'll be eternally grateful. Ethan is at university now, doing what he's always dreamed of. I never imagined we'd come this far." Julia held Grace's hand for a moment, her gaze sincere. "You both deserve every victory. And if you need anything, you know where to find me." Grace nodded, feeling the warmth of gratitude. After Julia said her goodbyes, Grace spent a few moments reflecting on how much things had changed. Life had been tough, but now there was a new balance, a new stability, the result of the courage and resilience that she and Ethan had built together. As the Chicago sun shone in the sky, Grace returned to her work, but with a lightness in her heart that she hadn't felt in years. The worst was over, and now she could finally dream of a future where sacrifice turned into victory. It was no longer about survival, but about building a new reality for herself and her son. Brandon and Tyler's months in prison had passed, and now they were free. The time behind bars hadn't been easy for the two young men, who, for the first time in their lives, felt the full weight of their action. The isolation, the shock of reality, and the loss of the privileges they had always been accustomed to forced them to reflect on their choices and behavior. Those 6 months of confinement transformed them in ways they hadn't imagined. Brandon, who had always been the more arrogant one, and Tyler, who followed him in everything, realized that the world didn't treat them with the same benevolence outside the bubble of privilege they had lived in. The weeks in prison made them more humble, less proud. They had time to think about all the people they had hurt, especially Grace and Ethan. On the day they were released from prison, their parents were there to welcome them. The families, who had once tried to protect their sons' reputations at all costs, had also changed. The public scandal affected them deeply, and the trial not only exposed them, but also taught them a lesson about boundaries and responsibility. Now, instead of looking for ways to cover up their sons' mistakes, Brandon and Tyler's parents knew that the only way forward was to make peace with the past. Brandon, in particular, felt the weight of remorse. He knew he needed to seek forgiveness from Grace and Ethan. During the months in prison, he had tried to imagine himself in their shoes, humiliated, publicly exposed, and struggling to survive in a world where the odds were few. Each passing day, Brandon felt the guilt grow, and he knew the only way to ease that burden was to confront his own mistakes. One afternoon, shortly after their release, Brandon and Tyler mustered the courage and decided to do what they had been putting off for months. They would go find Grace and Ethan to apologize, truly repentant for what they had done. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to face the consequences head-on, this time without the protection of their family's money or influence. Grace was at her candy stand as usual. The sun was high in the sky, and the city of Chicago seemed to hum with the sound of people on the street. She had found a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan was at university, building his future, and life was finally stable. The hard days seemed like a distant memory, and although Grace still faced the challenges of daily life, she felt lighter. It was then that, in the distance, she saw two familiar figures walking toward her. It was Brandon and Tyler. Grace's heart sped up for a moment, surprised to see them, but she didn't feel fear or anger. Instead, a calm curiosity filled her spirit. She knew the past had left deep marks on the two of them, and now they stood before her, ready to face her. When the two approached, Brandon and Tyler's faces were visibly tense. They looked insecure, their hands in their pockets, and their gazes hesitant. They had both changed, not just in appearance, but in the way they walked and looked at the world around them. Grace noticed this immediately. There was something different about them, something that time and the bitter experience of consequences had imposed on them. "Mrs. Williams," Brandon began, his voice trembling, unsure of how to proceed. We came here today to apologize, truly." Tyler beside him nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He looked at Grace with an expression that mixed regret and shame. "What we did to you and Ethan was terrible," Brandon continued, taking a deep breath. "During the time we spent in prison, we had a lot of time to think about what we did, and I know that what we went through doesn't even come close to what you and your son endured, but we're really sorry. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try to make it right." Tyler finally found the strength to speak. "I also wanted to say I'm sorry. I followed Brandon in everything, and I didn't have the courage to be better. I should have been a different person, but I was weak. What we did was unforgivable, and we just hope that one day you and Ethan can forgive us." Grace listened carefully, absorbing every word. Time had given her a broader perspective on life and hardship. She knew those apologies wouldn't erase the wounds, but as she looked into the eyes of the two young men, she saw sincerity. They were no longer the arrogant boys who had humiliated her months before. They were changed, broken by their own actions, and at the same time hopeful that they could rebuild something. For a moment, Grace remained silent. She looked at the two of them and then took a deep breath, allowing her emotions to guide her. "Prison must have been hard for you," Grace began, her voice soft, "and I hope you've truly learned something from it. We can't always fix our mistakes, but what's important is that you try to be better people from now on." Brandon and Tyler nodded, their faces full of gratitude and remorse. "What you did to me and my son was terrible," Grace continued, her eyes full of compassion. "But I believe everyone can change if they really want to. If you've learned the lesson and are willing to do better, then I forgive you. It's not easy, and it's not immediate. But I think life is about that. Learning from our mistakes and becoming better." Brandon and Tyler were deeply moved by Grace's words. They had come prepared for any reaction, except for forgiveness. They knew Grace had no obligation to forgive them, but the fact that she extended this hand of mercy meant more than they could express. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Williams," Brandon said, his voice choked with emotion. I promise I'll be a better person from now on. I promise too," Tyler added, visibly emotional. Grace smiled gently, and as they walked away, she felt a lightness in her heart. Forgiveness didn't erase what had happened, but it brought a necessary closure to that chapter. She knew Ethan would also need time to process this moment, but in time, he would understand that forgiveness was as powerful as the justice they had achieved. Later, when Ethan came home from university and Grace told him what had happened, he became thoughtful. The anger he had held in his heart toward Brandon and Tyler had lessened over time, but hearing about their remorse made him reflect. Ethan, now more mature, realized that moving forward also meant letting go of the weight of resentment. "If you've forgiven them, Mom, I can too," Ethan said with a sigh, feeling the emotional burden lift. Grace smiled and hugged her son, feeling that they were finally free, not just from the trial, but from all the pains of the past. The future, for both of them, was open and full of possibilities. And so Grace and Ethan moved forward, knowing that the path of justice, though tough, should always be walked with dignity and compassion. Life had given them immense challenges, but together they had overcome them. Now, more than ever, they were ready to live with the peace they so deserved. And that's how another touching story of overcoming justice and forgiveness comes to an end. If you enjoyed this journey with Grace and Ethan, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our stories. We have amazing content almost every day that will touch your heart. And don't go just yet. Click on the next video appearing on your screen and keep feeling moved by more stories. See you in the next video.